Well, thank you very much. I was here barely a week ago, and it's good to be back again. I don't know how good it is for you, but I keep enjoying myself every time I'm here. I was asked to speak something about what I had worked upon, which is not very easy for me to do because I tend to forget what I've written. So anyway, it's a great honor for me that you are going to spend the afternoon listening to some of the things that I've worked upon, and in this weather, it's not easy at all. So thank you very much, and thank you all for organizing this session. When I met you last, some of you at least, I talked to you about a book that I had just finished, and the title of the book was The Invention of Society. I won't repeat the entire thing again, except that this particular session is about state and sociology. So I think there is some point in running over some of the major themes. The first thing is this, that if you're going to do social science, you must remember that social science was almost impossible to conduct before democracy came into the picture. There was no social science earlier, and why was there no social science? For good reason. That is, there was no society earlier. What we know as society today, and take it very calmly, as if it were just there, is not really to be taken so casually because society is a very recent invention. And society came into being with democracy. Why is that so? Because with democracy, as you know, people are able to interact with one another across caste, class, stratifications of various kinds, such that what you do and I do impact each other. So democracy is not simply about politics and voting or elections or whatever, but democracy is very much about how we live with one another. That is the most important aspect of democracy. And as I'm never tired of quoting Ambedkar on this, when he said that democracy is not just politics, it is a way of living, an associated way of living of conjoined and communicated experiences. So that is what democracy means. Now, I was just trying to flesh that out a bit, and with the kind of reading that I had done in the past, I thought it was very important to explain what is it that democracy does specifically which other forms of authority were unable to do. And also to emphasize the fact that in democracy, there is a certain challenge that throws up to social sciences, and I'm not very sure if the social sciences have actually measured up to that challenge. Why do I say this? I say this because in almost all the sociological and social theories I've read, including, by the way, political science theories, I find that there is a certain tendency towards examining things as they are and in understanding society in terms of what is. But as we have been through tremendous changes in our own lives, and you will see many more coming up in the future, it is interesting that that aspect of the unknown is not within the grasp of sociological theory. What is within the grasp of sociological theory is what are the value normatives that are extant, existing, and operative in this society? What are the value consensuses available in society? How does society reproduce itself from time to time? It is very important to know that. Talcott Parsons once said that people criticize me for being a conservative, but look, the most important thing in society is that we are sitting on a powder keg, of all kinds of explosive material, and we're sitting on this powder keg, and somehow it doesn't blow us to pieces. Now, why is that so? And he felt it was so because there was value consensus, the normative consensus. We are all very clear about what should be done. And that aspect is shared broadly amongst all of us. Now, if we examine it closely, the point that struck me, because I was also looking at modernity over a long period of time, and I found modernity really, again, like democracy, is a recent construct. And what we see in terms of modernity is not just scientific or technological innovations. I think one of the most dramatic aspects of modernity is not science and tech. Of course it's there. But the most dramatic aspect of modernity is our relations between people. how social relations have undergone fabulous changes of the kind that could never have been imagined in the past. And this is what democracy has done. It has changed society enormously. I mean, even 50 years ago, and what we are today, is almost unrecognizable. And if I were to go back when I was born, which is close to prehistory, and then and now, you'll find that there's a big difference. What we accepted then as normal, and what should be done, and what is accepted as normal, and what can be done easily today. We never thought of these possibilities today. But that is why I asked myself, why is sociological theory concentrating itself primarily on value consensus and normative consensus, when from time to time that value and normative consensus has been broken, has been in fact broken quite into many pieces, and yet the society has remained stable. We've gone through various kinds of social relations which have been unpredictable. You might even say there were philippics of social movements. There were ups and downs of various kinds, and yet we've remained. Society hasn't broken down. How is that possible? And this is the challenge I threw myself to ask the question, how is it that in spite of the enormous changes in social relations, society hasn't broken down? If one were to go by Parsonian method, or Robert Merton for that matter, or any other major social scientist, you'll find that this aspect is not dealt with at all. In fact, for Robert Merton and Parsons, in all fairness, something like this would amount to a version of social deviance. And Robert Merton, in fact, put the problem in terms of social strain, the strain on society when such things happen. Of course there is a strain, but why is that strain not breaking up society like it should have broken up? Instead, society somehow finds the necessary wherewithal to weave itself back together again. Now, if we were to say that democracy is static, done once and for all, as most people believe. If I ask someone today, what is democracy, they'll probably rattle out whatever democracy has achieved today. But if I were to ask them 50 years ago, some of the things that we've achieved today would not have been there. And if I were to ask them 100 years ago, there'd be a whole lot of things that weren't there. For example, universal franchise. For example, right of women to vote. The right of minorities to vote. And now, as you can see, gays and lesbians have rights. Now, who would have thought that this was possible even 25 years ago? But today it is par for the course. Nobody raises an eyebrow. Say, oh, yeah, of course. Well, that's the way it is. Now, if such major changes have happened, how is it that democracy is allowing that to happen? And what is more important, that society hasn't fallen to pieces? How does one explain that? Much as I admire Parsons, as I told you earlier, I've taught Parsons and I've taught Habermas in this university to students who are of an earlier generation, and I taught them with a lot of enthusiasm and gusto, and well, I enjoyed myself. Sometimes people thought I was a Parsonian, sometimes they thought I was a Mertonian, sometimes they thought I was a Marxist, so all kinds of things went around. But the reason simply was that I really thought there's something to say. Sure, they do. But this one aspect struck me in the last 4 or 5 years. What happens when things occur which are really out of the box? How does one explain those? And why does the society still manage to retain itself? This is where the state comes in. I think this is where democracy comes in. And what does democracy do? It tells us not what we should do, as Parsons and Merton and others have said, or even Habermas, the life world. It's a whole lot of things that we leave untheorized because it's so much a part of our nature. But now we have to come to grips with the fact that certain things have been done today which were not prescribed in the past, and which probably in the past would have been seen as anathema, as something which is deviant in the social system. And yet it's not a deviant any longer. And I think democracy allows that for one simple reason, a fact which I believe, I'm here to be corrected, I believe a fact that somehow escaped many of our social theorists. I would be kind of, being presumptuous to argue that it occurred to me and to nobody else. That's not true. It probably occurred to a lot of people, and I may not have read their works, but it did occur to me, and I felt the most important aspect of democracy is not what can be done. Democracy tells us what you cannot do, and then leaves the rest open for you to do whatever you want to. So democracy allows you innovation, allows you adventure, allows you to change things, so long as you don't violate that basic principle about what cannot be done. And I took this inspiration from linguistic theorists who say that there's something called generative grammar. By the way, we may talk of this later on, but I disagree with the word G in ChatGPT, because the word G in ChatGPT is generative, whereas in my view, what ChatGPT does really is algorithmic. Generative grammar, which you look at from Saussure to Levi-Strauss to Chomsky, is that it works on a very minimal set of information and produces a whole lot of things. For example, ChatGPT can't pronounce E is equal to MC square, but once it is pronounced, it can play around with it and do wonders. So this is the point that Levi-Strauss made, for example, when he said that in the science of the concrete, you may have read the book, Savage Mind, some of you. The Savage Mind, the first chapter, is just fantastic. It's a brilliant chapter. I recommend all of you read it. Not just read it, perhaps learn it by heart. In the first chapter, he says that there's something called the science of the concrete. In the science of the concrete, the handyman, who in French is called the bricklayer, the handyman has a bag of tricks, and from that bag of tricks, the handyman keeps innovating and solves problems from time to time. It's like a person you might encounter when the old days the motor cars used to fail when it rains like this, and then suddenly somebody would turn up in a bicycle with all kinds of odds and ends, including a rubber band and some screws or whatever, somehow put your car together again so you can drive to the nearest petrol pump for repairs. That's a handyman. And that handyman doesn't make any inventions, but the handyman makes many innovations. The handyman is good at innovating things. So from a bag of tricks, the handyman can innovate a number of things, but it is still limited. Now, what does a scientist do in Levi-Strauss's thinking? The scientist operates from structure to structure, jumps over experiences. And this is something that can be done only by the human mind. And that is where the idea of generative grammar comes in. That is to say that on basis of very simple grammatical principles, a child can construct sentences that nobody has spoken before. And this is completely new. And yet everybody understands it. So on minimal information, a whole lot of new things can be done, whereas in artificial intelligence, you need a lot of information for something to be done. So now I see that if we were to look at linguistic theory and use that idea in democracy, then what does linguistic theory say? You can say whatever you want to, provided you observe the rules of grammar. In other words, there are certain things you cannot say. Once you observe those rules, the world is open. You can write poetry, you can do literature, you can even do sociology, can you imagine? All of that stuff is possible, provided you obey those basic rules of what cannot be done. Likewise in society, I think, there are basic rules that democracy sets out, saying what you cannot do and then leaves the rest open. So you're able to innovate, you're able to do things, and the society and the politics is quite accepting because you have not broken that one fundamental principle rule of what cannot be done. And once you observe that, I think state, democracy and social sciences are all in tandem. They work together in harmony, provided you understand that human beings in modern setup are not going to stand still. I'm not going to say there is a value consensus, there is a life world, and I subscribe to that, and so be it. That is the kind of world that prevailed in pre-democratic situations, when the emphasis was always on what should be done. Which is why in the last time I met you, I mentioned to you that when we talk in terms of what should be done, the prime example of that is snobbery. Snobbery tells you what you should do, and keeps it a secret so nobody else knows. But once you know the secret, then you're in the select club of people who are chartered members of the snobbery club. Now this is what snobbery does, and which is very, very unmodern. Whereas in a modern society, it is not about what should be done, how you should button your coat, how you should have a cup of tea or a cucumber sandwich, but it's all up to you. And this is the opening that democracy provides you, and this is the opening on which sociology functions. In other words, in my view, sociology functions in that gap between what democracy promises and what it has actually fulfilled. There's always a little gap. It's never complete. No democracy is ever complete. Anybody who tells you democracy is complete is a liar. Democracy can never be complete. Democracy is a work in progress, always working, just like modernity. Modernity is work in progress. Democracy wasn't complete in the mid-19th century because people didn't have the right to vote. There were property qualifications. It wasn't complete in 1910 because women didn't have the right to vote. So democracy has been slowly growing over time. It wasn't complete in India even after independence till untouchability was removed. It wasn't complete in India even 5 years after independence till the Hindu Marriage Act came in and women had certain respectable position in society. Now, these were things that have happened over time, and each of these were very, very contentious. And people thought, if women have the right to vote, if marriages can end in divorce, the family will break apart and there'll be no semblance of society anymore. And some of these people who argued this point of view were very important members of the party, of the freedom movement. And yet, it was pressed by certain other political leaders. It happened, and we are the better for it. We haven't suffered. Our society has become richer. So with each step in this transition, as we move ahead, we don't lose out. We get stronger. I think this is what democracy does, and this is what democracy does because it produces a society. And this is exactly why I quoted Ambedkar to you earlier. Do not think democracy is something which is just politics. You know, as a very close friend and savant of social sciences told me once that who told you that democracy was easy? Democracy isn't easy. It's the hardest job in the world. And I played with that over time. I've written 3 books probably with that in my mind. And I found that democracy isn't easy because democracy is like a delicate plant. Or shall we say, it's like a piece of porcelain, which is very delicate, very beautiful, but if it falls, it breaks, you can't put it together again. Democracy is not like a chunk of wood or a block of stone, which you can roll over and nothing will happen. That is what monarchy is. That is what theocracy is. But democracy is different, which is why it has to be looked after all the time. You take your eyes off the ball, and something wrong will happen. You're constantly on guard in democracy because democracy allows you to do things that nobody was allowed to do earlier and gives you full rights to do it, which is a reason I think that society is a recent invention, social science is a recent invention, and therefore social science doesn't have a history of persecution like the sciences have. It doesn't have a history of persecution because there was no society earlier. So there was no persecution earlier. In fact, if we look at the works of Saint-Simon, Montesquieu, even Condorcet, you'll find that they don't talk about persecution because nothing happened. Who faced persecution? Galileo faced persecution, right? Gardino Bruno faced persecution. That level in sciences. But in social sciences, nothing. Because there was no social science, because there was no society. And because there was no society, there was no persecution. And aren't we lucky that social science has a shallow history? I think that's something we should be really happy about instead of complaining. Many people, when they talk about social science, origin of sociology, origin of political science, you'll find they're going back in time, keep going back and back, and you find nothing. They'll get hold of some religious manuscript that is indecipherable, or somebody who wrote something way back. The Thomists said something, they said something. They don't matter because whatever they said has no relevance to society today. You have to be very careful when you go back in history because history is of no relevance in understanding contemporary sociology. And contemporary society is a brand new construction. I'm probably exaggerating it a bit, primarily to emphasize that this is something which should not be taken lightly. It's a very important consideration and we should always bear that in mind. So if you're thinking of social science and democracy, there is one thing you must always remember. No matter what Max Weber said or what anyone else said, social science should not be value neutral. Social science should always be value-laden. And what is that value it should have on its back all the time? Not like an incubus, not like a load, but like a flag to be waved with pride. And that value is the value of citizenship. That is the value that gives you all the problems to study in social science today. If you didn't have the value of citizenship, you wouldn't have the problems to study in social science. Because in social science today, what do you study? You study democracy has promised us this, and what has it given us so far? This. This gap is here. How to bridge that gap? Why is there inequality? Why is there persecution? What is the reason for all of that? Why do markets rise and fall? Why should that happen? And these issues have only come up with democracy. They were not there earlier. It is possible, however, that there'll be somebody who will do a sociology in a non-democratic society. And when that person does sociology over there, it is simply because that person is aware of what democracy can do and has had a glimpse of this other society, and is that knowledge this person is bringing to bear upon other societies. But in essence, without democracy, you cannot have sociology. Now let's move on to the next theme, which is, I think, related to this, and that is this. That in democracy, because as Ambedkar said, conjoint and communicable experiences, that's what democracy is, not just politics, but a form of living. Therefore, in democracy, you have something which is very significant, intersubjectivity. Now, what does intersubjectivity mean? It was never there in the past. In the past, when I said that, I think about you, I feel for you, it was rather a question of benevolence. I'm benevolent. And I'm thinking about you, look how nice I am. In fact, the Quakers, have you heard of the Quakers? It's a Christian sect. The Quakers said something which I really liked. The Quakers said, don't do too much good because it puffs up your ego. Hold it. If you think you're doing too much good, stop right there. Because it's not good for anybody, least of all for you, because you tend to become egotistic. We see that with many NGOs today. The leaders of many NGO organizations, which are doing very good work. But you see, they hold on to the organizations for life. They can't get over it because their identity is so closely meshed with the NGO that they're working for. And why is that so? Because in countries where democracy is incomplete in a big way, you find huge gaps in societies. And that is when Mahatmas come into the picture. In a good democracy, there'll never be Mahatmas. What do you need Mahatmas for? Mahatmas come into being simply because there's a huge gap. It revolts people aesthetically and empirically, which is why you have Mahatmas who are trying to fill that gap desperately, not knowing what else to do. If citizenship were in full flow, you wouldn't need that to be done. Which is why I say that there's one value you must hang on to. Not that value neutrality, which is very simplistic and jejune, in fact. Of course, you shouldn't carry your private interest into social sciences. You shouldn't be casteist. You shouldn't have your ascriptive identities bear upon your social science. But these are very minor things. The most important thing is that you must bear a value. And that value is that of citizenship, without which you cannot do social science. Even the basic problems in social science will never strike you. You'll really be quite, how should I put it, quite colorless, odorless, and without any impact on social science knowledge or society. Now, with this idea of citizenship, the fact is that intersubjectivity becomes important. Now, there are many people who have written about citizenship. Books and books and books have been written. But I, in my simple-minded way, I have picked on one particular author who I think has said the mantra for me, and that is T.H. Marshall's version of citizenship, in which T.H. Marshall says that the fundamental quality of citizenship is that everybody is given this baseline equality. On that baseline equality, this is the real important sting in the tail. On that baseline equality, structures of inequality may be built. In other words, once you're equal, go ahead and be as unequal as you want to be. But you must have that equality first. And what is that equality, if I were to go on with him, is that you must have the same kind of facilities in terms of education, health, energy, and so forth. And after you've got all of that, then go ahead and be as different as you want to. You want to be a scientist? Fine. You want to be an artist? Fine. You want to waste your time in the gutters? Fine. Go ahead. But that baseline uniformity has to be there. And this is what citizenship does. And once you have that, then you have intersubjectivity. The intersubjectivity is also a philosophical disposition, as you know. It's a highly, developed and well worked out philosophical position. But here I'm talking about intersubjectivity in terms of everyday common person's life. That I should be able to put myself in your shoes. I should be able to think of the world through your eyes, see the world through your eyes. That is something which is not so easy to accomplish. Which is why, again, I go back to Ambedkar, please bear with me, where he says that The most important thing in democracy, once more, is fraternity. Fraternity, without fraternity is no democracy. And why is fraternity so important? And why is fraternity the most delicate aspect of democracy? Because to put yourself in the other person's shoes, to see yourself through the other person's eyes, is something that goes against basic human nature. Human nature wants to see people differently all the time. And I have done a fair amount of anthropology, and I can tell you this, whether you're a Stone Age, whether you're a hunter-gatherer, whether you're in the Middle Kingdom, or in Hindu India, or in America, one thing is common everywhere. People tend to differentiate themselves from others. We are better than them. For example, the Kachins will say, the Shans are there, but Shans are not good enough. They're not quite evolved. They probably have a tail that they're hiding. Then there are people who are hunter-gatherers who think the others are not good enough at all. Hunter-gatherers, by the way. They're not developed civilizations. But everywhere, this is one anthropological failing, that human beings always tend to see themselves as different from the others. Let me go to Levi-Strauss's totemism. In totemism, what Levi-Strauss says is that social differences, we human beings tend to naturalize them. So they will say, Bengalis are like this, Punjabis are like that, and they naturalize these differences. English people are that, French, Chinese, Japanese, whatever. And this naturalization of differences is what is common amongst all of us. And that is why fraternity is so hard to cultivate, because fraternity must go against this principle that's bubbling inside us all the time. And that has to be curbed. That is very tough. And that is why democracy is tough. That's why democracy falters and breaks from time to time. It doesn't progress like that in a unilinear direction. There's forward steps, backward step, forward steps, backward step. But once democracy is tainted, it's very difficult to get it back in shape again. It's very difficult. It can happen, but it'll take a lot of time. And how does it happen? It happens because we yield to our base instincts. Jesus Christ said to Matthew, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Why did he say that to Matthew? Was his disciple. He said, Matthew, you're a Satan now. Get thee behind me, Satan. Why? Because Matthew, poor chap, said that, Lord, why do you want to suffer? They're going to make you suffer if you go there and give yourself up to justice of the Romans. Don't do that. So Jesus said, you want me to follow the ways of human beings, ordinary people. But it is my duty to suffer, because this is what my Father had ordained me to do. So you get behind me, Satan, because you speak the language of ordinary people. And what was Satan doing? Satan was happy to give Jesus the kingdom of the earth in bargain for the kingdom of heaven. So be like human beings is not good enough. You have to be different with what Jesus said. Likewise, what I'm going to tell you today is with fraternity, you can't be like an ordinary person. You are a different person, because you think of other people in the same ways you think of yourself. And this ability to be intersubjective is what makes modernity modernity. Modernity is not about fast cars, it's not about speaking English, not about going abroad, not about wearing fancy clothes, none of that. Modernity is about how do I relate with you. Therefore, my favorite example, which I've said time and time again and bored people to death, is the difference between Michael Madhusudan Dutt and Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar dressed like a Bengali, talked like a Bengali, looked like a Bengali. You know that English phrase that walks like a duck, talks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but isn't a duck? Well, he wasn't really a traditional person. He was a very modern person because his outlook was modern. It didn't depend on what he wore and what he spoke, but the way he related to other people was very important. Whereas Dutt was very Western in his ways, which is why the term bestoxication came into being. It was introduced by Iranian scholar, and that's also the reason why I explained earlier, in the earlier lecture, that M.N. Srinivas did not write on modernization, he wrote his book on westernization. He said, I can understand westernization in India, modernization is a much higher level of evolution, and we Indians haven't got there yet. And I think he was right. Westernization is very easy. I wear Western clothes, I speak a Western language, I go abroad all the time, I boast about places I've been to, people I know, and I'm very westernized. But being westernized doesn't make me modern. Modernity, democracy, social science, my friends, all go together. This intersubjectivity is what I'm looking for and not always finding it. And because intersubjectivity is so elusive, Therefore, the important point really is that modernity is always work in progress. Democracy is always work in progress. Democracy can never stand still. The moment it stands still is actually going backwards. So when the communists under Lenin said that dictatorship is the proletariat and they become the ultimate socialist society, when there'll be no more need for dialectics, he was actually going backwards. What dialectics meant was constant movement forward. And the constant movement forward was held back. So you cannot have a society where people say, we've reached the pinnacle of achievement. There was a time when Kant said that science had reached the pinnacle of achievement with Newton. And then Kant thought about it again, so that couldn't be true. And then he realized that it's not true because scientists do not think in terms of the phenomenal world alone, which is what guides them, but they hope that one day, if they try hard enough, really try hard enough, they'll crack it and they'll get to the noumenal world. They'll never get there, it's impossible. But it's that drive that makes them invent more and more, do more and more, and that is how science develops, because of that drive. I think that is the drive that we should have in the social sciences as well. Why leave it to the scientists? I think we are good enough too. The only problem is sometimes we are overwhelmed by all kinds of technologies of social science, like mathematics, for example, which is very, very important. It's a very good, important tool. But before we use it, we must ask ourselves, what is the academic question we are asking? Once you have that clear, then go ahead, as I said to you earlier, the world is your oyster. Thank you.